Please welcome Senior Vice President of the AARP Foundation, Emily Allen.
Looking forward to joining my fellow panelists and having this great discussion about how we really think about those cross-sector collaborations. We talk about that all the time, don't we? The importance of making sure that we aren't just talking and having the same conversation, but that we're inviting others to the conversation that perhaps have not been at the table before, including, in our case, older workers, but whatever individual populations you all are serving. So I'm delighted to invite my fellow panelists here, and I look forward to a great discussion. Thank you, and have a wonderful conference.
Please welcome Steve Lohr, Joe Fuller, and Michael Baston.
I'm Steve Lohr. I'm a reporter for the New York Times. I've written about about the field in recent years, really just starting from a question that seemed a good one. That is, how can you find, train, and create pathways to good jobs in the modern economy for the nearly 2/3 of Americans who do not have four-year college degrees? And my panelists are all active in that field across the board. At the far end, we have Emily Allen, who has already been introduced to you, Senior Vice President for the AARP Foundation. And again, this panel is called Cross-Sector Perspective. So we have a foundation, we have academic, and we have community college. So next to her is Dr. Michael Baston, who is the president of the Rockland Community College, and he has been a leader in pushing the nation's 1,100 community colleges to become increasingly efficient escalators of middle-class careers for more and more Americans. To our immediate left is Joseph Fuller. He's a professor at Harvard Business School. It's not an obvious place for a person to practice in this field to be from. We think of the Harvard Business School more as, CEOs on down rather than under disadvantaged workers rising up. But Joe has done a lot of research over many years on this subject, and including he was a co-author of an influential report called Dismissed by Degrees, which is the kind of subject we'll touch on. And part of his argument has been that this is a huge wasted potential, and that U.S. competitiveness suffers as well as American workers. Let's just start with Michael, actually. You've said, why not? You said in the past that associate degrees can't be, as you put it, paths to nowhere. You've emphasized close ties to working with local businesses, sussing out the skills that local companies need. And it strikes me that, if you look at the really successful community colleges and some of the very successful workforce development programs, including those that have gone through randomized control evaluations like Europe and Perscolis and a few others, what you see is essentially kind of building efficient local labor markets. And and the job of the community college president, as you are, is as much market maker as educator. So talk about that a little, and what community colleges are moving from and to.
Well, I think when you think about the development of the community college movement in America, this idea of democracy and promoting it in many ways, working alongside business and industry to more fully integrate opportunities for people in the local community is critical. But we have to be able to do this in partnership with our local business and industry leaders. So it is important for us not to simply put together programs that lead students on bridges to nowhere, but that we actually have to work with our business and industry partners to identify the opportunities and to also ensure that we are going to help diversify the labor market. We know that too many Americans are stranded assets, so much talent, so much potential, but ultimately disconnected from the opportunity ecosystem. So as a community college president, working with business and industry, working with hospital administrators to look at the shortages, to work with their HR departments, to identify those areas of skill gaps that have to be met. how do we use even shorter-term credential opportunities to build ladders to greater opportunities and economic wealth for members of the community long-term? So community colleges play a very critical role in being that critical connector with business, industry, our four-year partners, partners in government. We can really be that change agent.
Can you, just to follow up, can you give us an example of a program or initiative that you think is, either particularly encouraging or directional about where things need to go?
Sure, I can tell you about sort of the way in which we're working with healthcare. You think about many of the frontline workers in America, they're trained in community colleges, our nurses, our EMTs, all of those folks that were so critical in the pandemic are really being prepared in the community college. Our firefighters, our police officers, many of those folks are coming through our programs. And so we're working, for example, at Rockland with the local hospitals to develop new pathways for EMTs, new pathways for paramedics, new pathways, not just nursing, but in all critical care support services, and then the ladders for different opportunities within hospitals. Because it's not just healthcare. Hospitals need food prep folks. They need folks that are going to service the ambulance. You need all of the computer people, the accountants. And so really ensuring that the college becomes a partner in sort of talent development in all aspects of businesses. But healthcare is a very specific example that's happening in my community.
Joe, let's try you next. Again, how did you get into the field? Give me the brief Old Testament, the brief Old Testament history, and then, what have you found that's been either most striking or particularly or surprising in your research?
Well, I'm not sure it qualifies as Old Testament level story. There's no fire and brimstone, but
we don't need to mention so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. Yes.
I do have my detractors, but none with pitchforks that I'm aware of. Well, I actually kind of stumbled into this. I joined the Harvard faculty about 10 years ago, and at that time, at the business school, we had started the project to understand the evolution of the US economy in the aftermath of the Great Recession. And we'd done quite a lot of analysis to identify different contributing factors to the competitiveness of the economy and how our almost 100,000 alumni evaluated the competitiveness of the US relative to peer economies on those variables. Was it high or low, and was it increasing or decreasing? And evilly, the biggest mover in the wrong direction, decreasing, was the competitiveness of the labor force. And various faculty were studying individual variables. The project had been ongoing for 2 years when I joined the faculty. And I said, well, who's studying this one? The consensus answer was, well, no one, we don't really understand that. So I foolishly, not understanding this was the most complicated problem this side of global peace, raised my hand to start studying it. And it's led me in lots of different directions. We want to comment on two decision makers, primarily in corporations, but also political executives, senior bureaucrats, about what are the phenomena they need to understand to lead to a more productive workforce, a more engaged society, a more affluent society. I think my biggest surprise was the consistency with which companies have an incomplete understanding of their own economics. That, I'll just give you a quick illustration from some of my recent work. A lot of companies think or act as if having a high churn rate in their lower wage workers is actually biblical. It's an edict from the Almighty, that when Moses came down with the tablets, there were actually 3, as we all know. He dropped the 3rd one. So that's why we have 10 commandments, not 15. But the 15th commandment was, thou low-wage workers will turn over at a rate of over 50% a year, or whatever the equivalent in Aramaic would have been. So they anticipate that frontline retail workers, frontline hospitality workers are going to turn over at a high rate. So if you make that assumption, what's an intelligent decision for the employer? Job design's got to be pretty simple because it's got to be doable by newcomers. So people with very little experience have to be able to do an adequate job of it. What's the follow-on assumption? Well, the job's not going to be very productive, so I'm not going to pay very well, and it makes no sense to invest in the skills of someone who's going to leave within a year. So therefore, you have this super cycle with 44% of American workers in jobs below 200% of the poverty line. And when you look at my data, which I'm going to call actual data, when you look at actual data, what it says is that the low-wage workers turn over because they have low wages and little prospect of advancement. So if I can get a job that pays about the same 2 bus stops closer to home if I'm taking mass transit, or for 25 cents or 50 more cents an hour, why wouldn't I? Because I'm in a dead-end job. And that when you give low-wage workers opportunities to grow, add skills, have some prospect of advancement, whether that advancement takes place in the enterprise or by jumping into another career through skills developed in that first job, they want to stay. So when you talk to those employers, their entire understanding of the systems and the policies and choices that derive from those are based on an incomplete understanding of their own economics. It's the same thing with caregiving. They don't understand the extent to which caregiving concerns drive voluntary turnover asymmetrically in your top quartile of your workforce in terms of wages and title. That's just another blind spot. And I could go on, but then a seminar would break out and I'd have to charge you all tuition.
Emily, I'm really interested in your area. I mean, in writing about kind of the programs that work typically, their wheelhouse is 18 to 25, 35 tops, right? And that's a pretty, that's wiping off a fair part of the workforce, obviously, right? You go to an employer, why make the argument for why they should employ somebody 50 or older, as opposed to hiring somebody who's 25?
Oh, good. Well, heck, good question. I think it's a good question. Actually, as I look around the room, my guess is a lot of us are in that over 50 category.
Nobody'd hire us, that's for sure.
So, thank you. So, answer it for yourself. I mean, in some ways, I've been in this space for a long time, and I was thinking back, I think it was 2005, 2006 that AARP first did a study on the business case for hiring workers over 50. Good idea at the time. Learned a lot, obviously, from that. Looking at higher retention rates, loyalty. At the time we were using terms like more loyal and things like that, which actually kind of pitted the older adult worker against the younger worker. And that's something that I've really fought against since that time. I don't think it's an either or, it's got to be a both, And so I think the report was good at the time as we were really trying to engage employers, because one of the biggest things we would hear is, oh, well, I don't want to hire older workers because they're getting ready to retire, or they're going to cost me more in healthcare. And we found that marginally higher healthcare costs, but if you compare to 50-year-old marathon runner with a 25-year-old smoker, maybe not so much, So there was so much to unpack in all of that. And I think, again, it was a good idea at the time, but what I've really fought against since that time is it doesn't have to be either or, it's got to be both. And so a multi-generational workforce is really the healthiest and most competitive workforce for all employers across every industry. We know that people are living longer, working longer, and so, older adults have huge buying power. And so whether you're a retailer or a healthcare provider or whatever, it's so critically important to have workers that mirror your customer and client base. So that to me is more the message that we want to send, rather than keeping older workers in this separate kind of, segment over here, because you take a 40, and for those of you who don't know, if you're 40 and older, you're considered an older worker in a protective class. Usually there's a groan right about now, but it's true. So it's really almost all of us in this room that. So when you think about someone who is 50, they likely have a 20-year career left. So they're almost a mid-career worker, what we used to consider kind of a mid-career worker. So like I said earlier, let's start challenging some of those outdated stereotypes that an older worker is someone with one foot in retirement, who doesn't want advancement opportunities, who shouldn't be enrolled in that management training with their employer, because it's simply quite not the truth. So.
And you've got a number of programs that really try to lift the skills profile, employment, and income prospects for older Americans. I mean, if you got a favorite one or a recent one you'd like to point to as an example, again, directionally of
Sure.
What's encouraging?
Yeah, well, and I'll reference Jackie again too, because she was actually part of our Back to Work 50 Plus initiative, and actually took part in what we termed our Women's Economic Stability Initiative, which was funded. We were able to do an evaluation funded by the Social Innovation Fund. And what I love about it is it paired with the community college system, where we worked, again, cross-sector, focusing in on helping women like Jackie not just get the training they need and get them connected to employer, but really understanding much more from a human-centered design standpoint, what do they need beyond that to truly be successful? And so, yes, it was absolutely skills training, it was financial capability, it was computer skills training, it was building some social capital. So with coaching and connections to employers, so often individuals, we all know that social capital is so important for individuals when they want to re-enter the workforce or advance into a better job. What is it, like 80% of jobs are never advertised anywhere. It's kind of word of mouth or kind of who you know. So often individuals who have been marginalized in our populations throughout history don't have that type of social capital. And that's exactly what our Back to Work 50 Plus program has tried to do, is not just focus on the skill component. Yes, that's important, but how do we help individuals build that all-important social capital to get connected back to good jobs in their community?
Yeah, and in the what works vein, let's go back to Joe, because you guys have even done Harvard Business School cases on local communities where they've been successful. You got a favorite you'd like to point to?
Well, there are a number, and they all have attributes that your exchange with Michael touched on. There are several in Mississippi that have been very successful, where Mississippi enjoys a lot of benefits under TVA development grants for things like infrastructure improvements. And by that attracts the attention of people building large new facilities in a region, but you don't build a $100 million plant or a $200 million plant if there's no one to staff it. And so several of the regions in Mississippi and the Delta and the so-called Golden Triangle, which is up in the northeastern corner of Mississippi, working with their local community colleges, have developed specific programs to train up local citizens in the jobs that are going to be created by these employers. Starts often, for example, with basic manufacturing skills and process management skills, and then often the employer will then come in when they've decided to make the investment to top those up with specific skills. They even deepen the opportunity by pre-training people for advancement in anticipation of plant expansions. And these programs blend interventions to enhance the workers' soft skills and hard skills. And soft skills is a phrase we all use and none of us likes, but does communicate to all of you. Understands that just training somebody up in a very specific technical skill doesn't ensure workforce success. They have to understand the power skills that are associated with problem solving, with spontaneous communication, with the ability to ask questions, and with basic workplace etiquette like consistent punctuality. So these markets do play out regionally, as you suggested in your opening question. And I think that data, by the way, is also underlying what we see in the United States was highly uneven levels of workforce participation. We have regions that have low workforce participation and low unemployment, low workforce participation, low and high unemployment, and both other cells in the matrix. And I think that is a combination of the underlying business mix, but also the capacity of local skills providers to identify what those skills deficits are and to take active steps through the types of partnerships that Michael was talking about to create a work-ready cadre of people that will cause businesses to invest in growing their business in that site as opposed to going someplace else, or worse yet, shutting their business down altogether.
One of the subjects of this conference is supposed to be quote-unquote scaling, right? And one of the things that strikes me, at least, is that, this is, pun intended, a very labor-intensive process. It's not like software. You invent it, and the marginal cost of production is zero. That's when people in Silicon Valley talk about scaling. That's what they're talking about, right? And people usually are an irritating part of the process, except they're direct employees. But what do we mean by scaling, and what would help in scaling things out? And Michael, if you want to do it, because you have an executive position in the Community College Association as well as being in charge of Rockland. But I mean, what do we mean by scaling, and what would be particularly useful?
Well, as you think about the partnerships that I've talked about, that Emily's talked about, that Joe have talked about, it really is developing the frameworks that then can be shared and the best practices communicated so that we can replicate the good work together. How do we build effective collaborations? How do we build win-win propositions? How do we ensure that not only are we working with the folks that are currently in the system, but who's not invited to the conversation? Who's not being engaged effectively in the opportunity ecosystem? It is important for us to recognize, even in the community college space, that we don't just have those traditional students right out of high school that are coming in to the community college. We have the older adult who is coming back to the college to learn, to grow. I'm getting one of those cards now. I just turned 50,
Probably
so
got
I'm
one back in the back somewhere.
I'll be soliciting your donations.
Get one of those cards myself. It's important for us to recognize, and I've mentioned it earlier today, that we can leave no American behind with opportunities to get into a work situation, particularly with the demographic drought that we are facing. And so making sure that we are more connected to one another in very intentional ways and to replicate the best practices of those connections are going to be essential if we are going to move our country forward.
And this kind of moves, I think, a point Joe's made. It's about replication. It's not national programs necessarily. Emily, what in your world would make a difference?
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I kind of want to build on what Michael was talking about because, and now I'm going to put kind of my philanthropy hat on, both from a lot of what we fund is evaluation. So we want to make sure, to Michael's point, that a program can look really good. We're all guilty, AARP Foundation included, of building a solution and then going out and looking for a problem for it to solve, because we tend to fall in love with solutions, be it a technology solution or a programmatic solution. So let's work together to do the evaluation that we need. And maybe it's not that whole packaged program, but there are components of that then can be shared across and replicated. I think that's so critically important. And then with my philanthropy hat on, philanthropy can't solve this alone. It really is, to your point, Michael, bringing together and making sure that we have the various components of that ecosystem, that all-important ecosystem, Workforce services can't do it alone, nonprofits can't do it alone, government can't do it alone. So it's really important. One example that we're doing with a program that we've just launched called Digital Skills Ready, wonderful, generous grant from google.org, where we're really looking at what does it take to help older adults gain the technical skills that they need in order to get quality jobs in their community. And so, there's lots of digital programs or digital skills development programs out there, but we want to really dig into the evaluation to see for older adults what it takes, and then be able to replicate that through blueprints. Again, not, let's build on programs that are already out there, but really identify who needs to be at the table, particularly economic development, workforce, all of those groups, key employers, and then really look at how do we implement the key components of what's working.
I think our time is about, we have time for, we have 20 seconds, actually, we're being told.
18.
One big change, I mean, if you're gonna, that would help you, each of you, I mean, this is, they call the lightning round, as they say, but I mean, it's a shift that you like to see, attitude, funding, whatever, incentives. Joe, why don't you take it?
Significant national commitment to early work-based learning in high school.
In academia, we used to say publish or perish. I would say partner or perish. If we do not partner, we will perish.
I would say look at the table that you form or the groups that you have and figure out who's not there that needs to be there.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thanks to your panel. Appreciate it.